When communism took power in China in 1949, all contact between America and China ceased. No trade, no exchange students. America dared not try to fix the situation, only watched in fear as an old friend became an enemy. Then, 1971, the height of the Cold War. Nations were afraid to take sides, afraid of becoming a target of either country. The issue threw not only the affected countries, but the entire world into debate and controversy. It seemed nearly impossible at this time for China and the U.S. to reconcile. The fight between communism and democracy left no room to coexist and left the relationship between China and the U.S. completely broken. But a little round ball and new opinions led U.S.-China relations in a whole new direction. Collectively, the events that led to the renewed relationship between China and the U.S. became known as the era of ping-pong diplomacy. Ping-pong diplomacy happened as a twofold event, the first part taking place at a 1971 table tennis championship in Japan, and the second was a visit of the U.S. table tennis team to China. At the Japanese championship, one memorable display of diplomacy initiated the first contact between China and America in 20 years. On the afternoon of April 4th, American player Glenn Cowan mistakenly climbed into a van carrying Chinese players. The champion Chinese player, Zhuang Zhidong, initiated a conversation with the noticeably embarrassed Cowan. By the end of the ride, Zhuang and Cowan had exchanged gifts and publicists had snapped several photographs of the event. After several years of disconnect between China and America, a bond had been made and a diplomatic tie had been established. This friendly and informal event of Zhuang and Cowan's exchange set the Chinese delegation to talking. Could now be the time to allow Americans back into China? And could the American ping-pong players act as guinea pigs in this experiment? The majority of Chinese delegation was against the idea, yet some still had hope that, through ping-pong, Chinese and American peoples would have a way to interact without political ramifications. Debate over whether the U.S. ping-pong team should visit the Chinese mainland also came from Americans. Many were worried about the safety of the players. One player was only 15. Could China really be counted on to keep this young player safe during her time there? One of the U.S. players was a South Korean national. China worried that extending an invitation to this player would look like an olive branch extended to the South Korean government, creating political chaos. Would the trip actually happen? The answer was uncertain, until Mao Zedong, then the leader of China, made the surprising final decision to invite the American team to China.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to visit China. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
On April 10, 1971, the American table tennis delegation arrived in China and began their historic 7-day visit. During the trip, the Americans toured Chinese landmarks and played exhibition matches with the Chinese, fostering even stronger relationships through ping-pong.
I'll never forget in the stadium, in the interior building where they had the first match with the Chinese, filled with thousands of Chinese watching.
This match in Peking was played in a new auditorium with 18,000 seats. They were all filled.
Long-haired Glenn Cowan caused a stir when he appeared with his long hair held in place with a red headband. The crowd sat attentively, applauding the good shots and showing no partiality between nationalities. The Chinese finally won, as had been expected. Then came the closing ceremony, more impressive than the start. Incredible afternoon. Chinese cheering Americans, clapping hands, Americans and Chinese holding hands. A remarkable display of warmth and goodwill. In sports at least, the Chinese and Americans have obviously found a common meeting ground.
Ping-pong diplomacy was not only about the American table tennis team and their impression of the Chinese during the trip, but also the changed opinions of the American public. Much of the new perception was due to positive media coverage of the trip. Two renowned newspapers publicized goodwill between the Chinese and Americans. An editorial in Life magazine proclaimed that atmospherics had suddenly improved and that numerous doors had been opened. The New York Times predicted that China would be accepted into the UN shortly. In past years, China had invaded Korea and Taiwan, thus making the nation less attractive as a potential member. In 1971, after the table tennis trip to China, the outlook was so vastly different that the majority of Americans supported China's admission to the UN. This detail, and the fact that China did indeed become a member of the UN in October 1971, showed that Americans had begun to view China as a friend, not a foe.
The
United Nations General Assembly voted last night to admit Communist China. The moment was a turning point in history, foreshadowing vast changes in international relations.
The players' opinions also influenced the American public dramatically. Their opinions were unbiased and ordinary, as if they were just average people on a vacation. The players each had individual highlights, but three themes reoccurred throughout the vast sea of their comments. 1. The Chinese displayed unexpected hospitality and friendship. Players commented that the Chinese were all very warm, extremely gracious, really fantastic, and that they laughed at every joke. 2. The players were surprised at just how wrong their preconceived image of China had been. According to one official, the Chinese were perfect hosts. A reporter commented that they seemed happy and filled with purpose. The third surprise was the reality of the socialistic political structure. Players commented that the Chinese were not forced into working, they were united, the workers had power, no criticism of China could be found, and that women were nearly equal to men in the workforce. One player even wanted to see the Chinese system implemented into American government.
The Americans picked up on it very quickly. Nixon had already started using better language against China. He called them the People's Democratic Republic of China, and that softened things a little, but the decision had been made to make things better between the United States and China.
After the preliminary exchanges, the Premier brought up what seemed to have been on his mind all along. It was a momentous statement as far as the future of China and the United States was concerned. He said a new page was opening in U.S.-China relations.
President Nixon was also encouraged by the press. After the trip, official relations between the U.S. and China developed rapidly. Nixon accepted 5 new measures concerning China, one of which was to end a 21-year ban on U.S. trade with China. On April 16th, Nixon gave a strong hint that he might visit China while in office, and on May 17th, it was formally indicated that Nixon was planning to visit Beijing. Truly, the barriers formed between China and America some 20 years earlier had been broken down.
To greet the first American president to set foot on Chinese soil. East meets West as a handshake bridges 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostility.
China and America's relationship has come a long way since the days of the Cold War, and even the era of ping-pong diplomacy. However, several of the subsequent effects of this new relationship have caused debate in our modern society. Some American manufacturers have gone out of business as Chinese labor has become cheaper than American labor. Some Chinese-made products have also been linked to American deaths, specifically from lead poisoning. China and America have also had many smaller conflicts in past years, such as the attacks on civil rights activists' ability to access Google accounts in China, and a March 2009 standoff between American and Chinese ships in the South China Sea. Despite these conflicts, America's renewed relationship with China has yielded significant benefits for both nations. In 2008, Beijing hosted the Olympic Games. Due to outsiders' negative views of China's social and political practices, this event may have never taken place had it not been for China's connection to the U.S. Recently, President Barack Obama of the U.S. and Hu Jintao of China have been working together to tackle global issues such as climate change, trade balance, and even tension in Tibet. Although often seen in a negative light, the U.S. and China have an active and cooperative trade economy. Zinc, nickel, lumber, and mining and oil equipment are popular Chinese exports to the U.S., while tobacco, corn, and precious metals are popular imports to China. China is proving itself to be a vital ally to the U.S. as a whole.
Ping pong happened to be the medium through which better relations was established. Where governments and politics have failed, sports have succeeded.
Who would have thought that a little white ball would have been the catalyst for such a dramatic, instrumental change in Chinese-U.S. relations? The sport of ping pong instigated an almost neutral status between the two countries in the first weeks of the Japanese Table Tennis Championship in early 1971. Ping pong was the connecting element between Glen Cowan and Zhuang Zhidong, and the gateway for the first Americans to set foot in China in over 20 years. Through the aspect of ping pong, much of the American public conceived a new image of China. Truly, ping pong diplomacy initiated a bond between the two nations, a bond that would last the ages, as more than 30 years of alliance has already shown. A little white ball that bounced its way into history. It's a success story of a sport which initiated phenomenal diplomatic consequences.
The Army decided that I should be on the All-America Ping Pong team. We were the first Americans to visit the land of China in like a million years or something like that. Somebody said world peace was in our hands.